Now quite a lot has changed for the Space Marines over the last 6 months or so I thought it was high time to revisit the Aggressors as they remain one of the strongest units in the game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. In today's video we'll be doing another Space Marine unit review, this time focusing on the Primaris Aggressors, looking over their datasheet, talking over the many different options that you have for running them in a more competitive list, and how I would think about using them in game. I've been looking forward to making this video. I made an Aggressors video pretty early when I was starting out in YouTube. They remain one of my favourite units for the Space Marines, and now that all of the Space Marine units have had their Psychic Awakening update, I'm pleased to say that pretty much every faction has a decent use for these guys. In the lore, the Primaris Aggressors are specialist close quarters Primaris formations equipped in their iconic Mark 10 Gravis armour. They provide blistering close range fire support and hefty combat punch with those Boltstorm or Flamestorm gauntlets, and it's well known that a single aggressor can cut through entire formations of enemy light infantry in a very short amount of time. Aggressors are often deployed in close quarters confined conditions, where the long range weapons of the chapter's Devastators will find little use, not being able to reach targets. They're a useful alternative to chapter Centurions for this role, being far more mobile than them and able to traverse broken ground with relative ease. It's an unlucky foe indeed, who has to fight Space Marine aggressors at close range. So now we'll take a look at the Aggressors datasheet, and of course credit to the excellent Warhampedia for this version with the points costs. Aggressors are of course an elite choice for Codex Space Marines, and they'll cost you 37 points per model when they're armed with what I'd consider the standard loadout of their Auto Boltstorm Gauntlets and Fragstorm Grenade Launcher. You get 3 Aggressors per squad, including the Sergeant, and can buy up to 6, and they have a fairly beefy stat line with a movement of 5, weapon skill and ballistic skill 3+, strength 4, toughness 5, 3 wounds, 3 attacks, leadership 7, and a 3+ save. Point for points, they're fairly durable against pretty much all weapons, only being 12 points per toughness 5, 3+ save wound. Their middling profile does have its disadvantages though, because it means that both anti-infantry and anti-tank weapons will be fairly efficient at killing them, but most weapons won't be incredibly efficient unless they're flat damage 3. I'd also just like to note their attacks characteristic of 3 and 4 for the Sergeant, which means that a full squad of aggressors is going to be getting a mighty 25 attacks on the charge with Shock Assault, and as their Boltstorm Gauntlets are essentially power fists, this is going to translate to a lot of wounds on enemy units, no matter whether they're vehicles or infantry. Talking of their war gear, those Boltstorm Gauntlets, as well as acting as power fists in melee, also put out a murderous hail of bolt shots. They're 18-inch Assault 6 weapons with Strength 4, AP 0 and Damage 1, and if you're taking the Boltstorms then you must take the Fragstorm Grenade Launcher, which gives you an extra d6 Strength 4 shots at the same range. Basically it's just worth keeping in your head that each aggressor will put out an average of just under 10 shots per turn, though of course that can vary pretty wildly depending on how well you roll for those Fragstorms. As most of us know, we can double the firepower, but even at just this amount of shots, that's already a pretty reasonable return on investment in terms of amount of bolter shots you're getting out of them per point invested. For example, 2 intercessors with the auto bolt rifles cost 36 points, pretty much the same, and they only get 6 shots where each aggressor gets 9 or 10. I think we do really need to talk about their special rules if we're evaluating their shooting, and they have 2 excellent ones in Firestorm and Relentless Advance. Now Firestorm is the big scary one, which gives aggressors the ability to shoot twice if they didn't move in the same turn. That means if you start a turn and your opponent is already within the 18-inch range of these weapons, you have the option to stay put and get an average of 19 shots out of every single aggressor, which translates to a hilarious 114 shots out of a full unit of 5. It's just an insane amount of firepower for a unit that only costs 222 points. You're literally paying around about 2 points per bolt shot. It's really interesting that this is an ability that activates per turn as well, rather than per battle round, so it means that if the aggressors get to fire in your opponent's turn for whatever reason, say they're firing Overwatch, then this rule is always going to be in effect. If your opponent wants to charge your 6-man aggressor squad, then they're going to be getting 114 shots in the face. It also works for other things, such as the Chapter Ancient's ability to make them fight when they die, and there's a few other chapters that can cause them to shoot as if stationary, which we'll get onto. Their other rule, which is also great, is Relentless Advance. This means that if they do move, then they can advance and still fire their assault weapons without suffering the -1 penalty. So any turn when you both feel that you need to move and don't feel that you want to charge, you're going to be basically getting an extra d6 movement out of these guys absolutely for free. Tactics wise, this means that your aggressors basically have 3 different modes each turn, and you need to choose which of them you're going to use. Either stay stationary and get the double shooting ability if there's targets in range, move their standard 5 inches to try and get in range, do some shooting and then charge, or forego the ability to charge and advance to still get the same amount of shooting and increased movement. Having options like this is really powerful, and you can just choose the best of these for your unit each turn in game. In terms of other special rules, they have combat squads should you want to break them in half into 2 units of 3, which I typically wouldn't tend to do. I think that larger units are generally going to be better because they mean that you'll be massing all of that Overwatch at once, and it gives them a bit more resiliency and staying power in combat. Your opponent might be able to wipe out a squad of 3 aggressors, but they might only be able to kill 3 out of a squad of 6, and then the other 3 will also be in combat, so be able to punch back. Plus, big units of 6 are a bit more efficient for any buffs that you might have going, such as stratagems. They also have Angels of Death for an extra attack with Shock Assault. As we already mentioned, 25 Power Fist attacks makes a mess, and it nets you around about 14 wounds on your standard toughness 7 vehicle if you charge and don't take any casualties. Furthermore, they also have combat doctrines, which if their shooting was good before, then the tactical doctrine will take them to the next extreme. You can now have AP-1 on those 114 bolt shots, and honestly there's very little targets in the game that won't be fairly points efficient against. Even just having that extra 1 pip of AP is enough to make them twice as good at units with 2+ saves, and just the mass weight of dice will do the rest. With no buffs at all, if you do get to double shoot them, they will typically, on average, kill around about 38 Orc Boys, do about 19 wounds to Primaris Intercessors, or about 12 wounds to another standard toughness 7 vehicle. So you really do have the option just to one-shot something like a Rhino in the shooting phase, never mind bothering to charge it. Obviously, if you move, then you have to halve all of those numbers, but 19 Orc Boys, 10 wounds on Intercessors, and 6 wounds on a vehicle is far from bad for a unit of its points cost, and that's before you hopefully get into melee with something. Now, so far we haven't talked about their other war gear option, which are the Flamestorm Gauntlets, which replace both the bolter profile and the Fragstorm grenade launcher of your standard Boltstorm Gauntlets. These ones run the aggressors at 2 points cheaper, at 35 points each, and 105 points for a 3-man unit. Instead of the average of 9.5 shots at 18 inches, they will get an average of 7 auto hits at 8 inches. So if we ignore the points cost for a second, that means they're basically getting on average around about 1 extra hit compared with the Boltstorms, provided you can get them in range. Also, being flamers means that they don't care about modifiers, which is helpful. For me though, they're already reasonably short ranged at 18 inches, and reducing that to 8 for a very marginal increase in damage output is just a really bad idea. Sure, if you're in range, you'll get very slightly more damage out of them, but I think there'll be many occasions in the game where you're just not going to be in range of anything because of your flamers over the Boltstorms, or perhaps just not in range of the thing that you actually want to shoot, so you're forced to shoot something right up close that you might have charged anyway, rather than using the Boltstorm Gauntlets on something further away and then wrecking the nearby target in close combat. For me, the Flamestorm Gauntlets just really don't work for them at the moment, and the only place that I'd be tempted to try and make them work is the Salamanders chapter, though even then I think it's a pretty close run thing between them and the Boltstorms, because despite the Salamanders' multiple flamer buffs, that 18-inch range just makes them so more universally viable and useful. So overall, the Aggressors are a decent ground-bound infantry squad, with epic damage output at range versus infantry, with the limitation that it's quite close-range damage output. They also have strong melee, and are reasonably durable against most threats, and their biggest issue is trying to get their close-range firepower and close combat to bear on the enemy, as their base movement isn't all that high. So now we'll talk a little bit about what else we can do to make these guys stronger in-game. So first of all, I thought we'd talk about chapters. As I was running through the list of chapters, it made me realise that Aggressors really are one of the units that can gain something incredibly useful from every single chapter that they can be included in. They're just a good unit for synergy with various special rules going, and no matter what Codex Space Marines you play, they will make your Aggressors very powerful in one way or another. Starting off with perhaps the most obvious, we have Ultramarines, who fix one of the Aggressors' biggest weaknesses, the fact that they can only stay stationary while they do that double shoot move, by having their doctrine Scions of Guilliman, which allows them to move and double shoot as if stationary while they're in the tactical doctrine. They also have abilities to put units in the tactical doctrine in the very first turn, so you could have potentially 2 different units of Aggressors turn 1, moving 5 inches and double tapping with 114 AP-1 bolter shots, right from the absolute word go. On top of this, they have excellent character synergy, things like 2 litanies from Chaplain Cassius to give them +1 to hit and +1 to wound, Targarius to give a unit -1 to hit, and either Manius Calgar or Guilliman to give them 4 rerolls both in the shooting and combat phase, and it all comes together in an incredibly scary unit. Aggressors are possibly one of the strongest units that you can include in an Ultramarines army. White Scars have excellent synergy as well, as they make the strategic decision a little bit simpler. You don't have to choose between advancing and charging, you can just happily do both. This means that White Scars aggressors can just pile straight forward, not having to worry at all about limiting their movement, and they give you a really solid chance of making combat early, and you can buff that with things like Plume of the Planesrunner for +1 to charge. White Scars also have an outflank option for them, which is another solid way of delivering an aggressor squad right up to the enemy. Raven Guard is another absolute top tier option for aggressors. Their chapter tactic, getting cover or -1 to hit, is great, but even better is being able to access their stratagems for deep striking aggressors, which again fix their main issue by delivering them straight to the fight. They'll be able to make a whole ton of bolt shots happen before charging into the enemy, which you could also increase the charge range by using the +1 to charge successor trait or maybe a chaplain listening. On top of that, there's also the Master of Ambush stratagem, the one that allows you to redeploy a unit before the game, which means that you can have an aggressor squad starting just outside the enemy deployment zone turn 1, and then you can either move, shoot and charge as per normal, or just sit there and unload our favourite number of bolter shots. As well as Raven Guard, Iron Hands have absolute top flight aggressors, this time because of their slightly infamous tournament build, the castle that they can make with Phyros and the Chief Apothecary. This will give your toughness 5 3-wound aggressors a 5+ invul save and a 5+ feel no pain, which basically makes them exceptionally durable against pretty much any weapon in the game. It doesn't sound like that much of an upgrade until you've played them. You would be amazed at how few aggressors your entire army's firepower can kill when they're buffed by this pair, and then you can either heal them or even just stand them back up again by using the Apothecary's heal abilities. Iron Hands also get 5+ Overwatch, which is crazy on that amount of shooting, and even if you don't have the Chief Apothecary around, a 6+ feel no pain type save is really good on 3-wound models like these. It absolutely kills the efficiency of flat damage 3 weapons at taking them out. Next we come on to Salamanders, and these guys have absolutely tons of combos with aggressors that might well warrant its entire own vid at one point. Just to start off, their Crucible of Battle stratagem gives them +1 to wound, which is excellent both for the bolters and the flamers, as having low strength can hamper them against hard targets, and it takes your strength 4 AP -1 shooting to being not just good against everything in the game, but great against everything in the game. This can also be comboed with their buff to their flamer weapons. When they're in the tactical doctrine, they get +1 to wound, which does reward you if you have taken the flamers. Their Master Artisans type rerolls will help them both in the shooting and fight phase and make the squad even more durable. In defense, they have access to excellent psychic powers in +1 toughness and -1 to hit from their librarian, and they have the Obsidian Aquila for a 6+ feel no pain type save, which we already said why that was good with Iron Hands. On top of this, the Salamanders also have access to a stratagem that allows a unit to have counted as stationary after moving. This means that much like the Ultramarines, they have the ability to make a unit of aggressors move 5 inches and then double tap their guns. I'd say just literally the combo of move and shoot, 6+ feel no pain and +1 to wound is an absolutely viable reason to run aggressors, even if you take no notice of the Salamander's flamer rules, and I certainly think that Boltstorm aggressors are perfectly viable in a Salamander's army, if maybe not quite as fluffy. When we do look into the flamer weapons though, provided you can somehow deliver them and get them in range, you're looking at +1 to wound from the Doctrine, potentially extra mortal wounds or auto-maxing their shots from stratagems, extra buffs from Vulcan Hestan, and you can potentially even fire their flame weapons in close combat. If you can get Salamander's flamer aggressors in range, there's almost no target in the game that isn't going to wither to the heat. They'll obliterate infantry and pretty well melt every vehicle. If you did want to apply the short stack of stratagems, like move and double tap, get max shots, and +1 to wound, and you decided to use all of these on one Salamander's flamer aggressive squad that was in range, you get a casual 144 strength 4 hits at AP -1 and +2 to wound. That's an average of 36 wounds on an Imperial Knight, so if they have the range on them, then you're happily going to be melting 1.5 Knights, even if you have no other characters or buffs around, and that's before you get to charge. Their damage output is absolutely ludicrous, it's just getting there to be able to do it that's the issue for Salamanders. Moving on further, the Imperial Fists need no explanation when it comes to bolt weaponry. A flat increase of the exploding 6s for their bolt weapons is a useful 25% increase in their damage output, and ignoring cover can be extra good for chewing through things like Space Marines that are dug in. Aggressors shoot well normally. In Imperial Fists, they just plain shoot better. Crimson Fists are also interesting as well, as they're small units that can be good against hordes, so they're quite often going to be getting the +1 to hit, say if they're firing into a mob of Orc boys. Buffs such as the Eye of Hypnoth can help with wound rolls, and they seem to be pretty fluffy units to me for these chapters, having enormous power fists. Black Templars will be good for combat aggressors. They'll get there a little bit easier with their very nice reroll charges, and having protection against mortal wounds is pretty handy as they are a pretty efficient source of killing aggressors. They can also access a once per game 4+ invul save, which is pretty useful for keeping them safe in the first turn, should your opponent be able to unload a fair bit of fire into them. For the non-Codex Space Marine chapters, we have the Blood Angels, again excellent for close combat, having +1 to charges and an enormous +1 to wounds whenever they make a charge, which just amps up their combat efficiency massively against things like vehicles or knights. They also add some very useful shooting to a Blood Angels army, which is often all about the combat, and having a combat unit that can actually really quite efficiently clear screens can be really helpful to support the wider army. The standard of sacrifice for a 5+ feel no pain is excellent for aggressors. You do have to bunch up a bit, but if you're just walking up the board, then this will really increase their durability and allow more to survive to later game. They also have all manner of character buffs and the option to give them a 5+ invul save with the power Shield of Sanguinius. Aggressors often get a bit overlooked in the Blood Angels army, as it's all about the jump units most of the time, but a solid core of these advancing around a standard of sacrifice could cause enormous problems for your opponent and really make them want to back off the midfield. Dark Angels have a couple of advantages, in particular their unique combat doctrine giving a little bit of extra range, meaning that you can either stay put first turn if they're in range, or just be in range of more things if you're moving anyway. They're also one of the only chapters that can give aggressors a 4+ invul save to shooting, thanks to Chapter Master Azrael, who can do this for infantry within 6 inches, and the aggressors are infantry. He's a really good pairing with them as well, as it gives them 4 rerolls to hit, both in combat and in shooting. And much like the Blood Angels, you can just march a very, very durable core of aggressors up to the centre of the table to beat down your opponent in the midfield. You could further augment their firepower with having a friendly Talon Master follow them along behind, giving some reroll 1s to wound and ignores cover, and maybe even have a Dark Shroud nearby to make them all -1 to hit. That little combo might be expensive and has to bunch up a bit, but it gives you every single offensive buff that you'd want, and also enormously hard to shift in defense. Next we come to the Space Wolves, who are again a fairly combat orientated chapter, and like the Blood Angels they can certainly help out with clearing some screens and things with that excellent firepower. The aggressors have beautiful synergy with Hunters Unleashed, giving them a mighty +1 to hit, which is really good as their power fists usually make them -1, so it's a relatively better damage increase than the Blood Angels on most targets. Space Wolves also have an outflank stratagem, meaning that you can get the aggressors closer without getting them shot, and access to Wolf Priests who can both heal them and also use their unique litany to give them +1 damage against monsters and vehicles, meaning that each power fist is hitting with all the force of a Thunderhammer. Slight issues with getting them into combat, but at least they can contribute to the fight with their shooting while they're on the way. Finally, they might not be taken very often in Deathwatch, at least not as the full aggressor unit, but Deathwatch are one of the chapters that can deep strike aggressors as well, and also do this in tactical doctrine, potentially coming in by a Watchmaster, who is a chapter master who you don't have to pay the extra 2 command points to get. They've got some pretty reasonable anti-Xenos stratagems, and of course you can include aggressors in a kill team, where you could pair 5 aggressors with 5 Primaris intercessors, giving the entire unit toughness 5, and it allows the intercessors to tank wounds for the aggressors, while also providing their boosted special issue ammunition shooting profiles. Deathwatch also have another relic that gives them a 5+ invul save, it was a little bit unhelpful as the bearer has to stay stationary, meaning that it's not quite as easy to pull off. So overall, basically every chapter has really strong ways to run aggressors, each with their own unique tricks to bring something different to the table. They are very rarely going to be a bad addition to the army, particularly if you build around them somewhat. Moving on to character buffs, we can obviously get all of our rerolls from captains, and particularly chapter masters are excellent for aggressors, as their 4 rerolls to hit in the fight phase work very well with the aggressors -1 to hit with their power fists, so they get a little bit more out of chapter masters than most. Litanies can be great, both for +1 to hit and +1 to wound the nearest target, and they'll often be shooting the nearest target because they're quite short ranged, and also if you are using one of the many ways to get aggressors in via deep strike or teleport, having the +2 to charge cast by a chaplain can easily be the difference between them making it into battle or not. Chapter Ancients can always be a reasonable include in an aggressor castle. Having the ability to shoot a bunch of its weapons when they go down is really powerful, or make one less attack in the fight phase, and Apothecaries can certainly heal them. They're fairly big tanky models, so if you can bring any back to the fight then that's usually going to be a good investment, but doubly so that Chief Apothecary that also provides a 6+ Feel No Pain type aura, which is just an excellent upgrade on big tough multi-wound models and will really help them stay in the fight. In terms of transport vehicles, we can use both variants of Repulsor, and that can certainly be a way to get an aggressor squad up into the midfield without getting shot too quickly, or just at least keep them safe from an alpha strike from the opponent's army turn 1. In general, for most purposes, I'm more of the opinion that I'd rather just take more aggressors than buy repulsors for them, though that's partly due to the way that transport rules work at the moment. In terms of stratagems, aggressors are big firepower rich squads, as we've mentioned, so likely any stratagem that buffs firepower output or damage in the fight phase will be very efficient on them, depending on what chapter you're from. The deep strike abilities are ones that you should absolutely consider depending on your chapter. But from the main codex, things like Honour the Chapter to Fight Again can be great when you're hitting with these 25 Power Fist attacks. Transhuman Physiology can really help blunt the impact of heavy weapons on an aggressor squad. Gene-Wrought Might can get you some extra hits in the fight phase. Auspex Scan can be great if you have an enemy unit jump down next to them, allowing you to immediately hose them with that many bolter shots, and they'll all be able to fire twice, due to it being your opponent's turn, so 19 bolter shots out of each aggressor. A very good use of 2 command points. Finally, more for fun, you can use Honoured Sergeant to perhaps give an aggressor sergeant a relic of some sort. The Mastercrafted weapon is a pretty powerful option, giving you an additional pip of damage. You could be having damage D3 plus 1 Power Fist in combat, or damage 2 Boltstorm Gauntlets at shooting, which could really help chew through those Primaris intercessors if you are facing a lot of them. If you're actually talking about using them in a game, then your strategy is going to heavily depend on which chapter you're using, and we have talked a bit about that already. If you're playing one of the ones that has the option to put them in reserve and then deep strike them in, then that's a decision that you're going to have to make at the start of the game. It can generally be a pretty decent idea if you're playing a mobile army or one with a lot of long range firepower, to at least guarantee them to be able to get up close and do some damage. But if you're playing a low firepower army that's swarming towards you, such as maybe orcs or chaos demons, it might be best just to start on the board, to hose them down with bolter fire as they get close, and then maybe countercharge. As a general rule, if you're not setting them up like that, you typically want to be deploying them front and centre. They have short range, and you really don't want your opponent just being able to ignore them, which means they are going to have to be brave and generally slog it through the centre of the battlefield to prevent your opponent from just falling back away from them. As infantry, they can go straight through ruined walls, which means that you could set them up out of line of sight, and then walk forwards and unload the bolter fire and maybe charge. Even if you can't manage out of line of sight, at least try and get them in cover, as there's a big difference between going from a 3+ save to a 2+ save, particularly against AP0 weapons. As we said previously, each turn we're going to have to think about which of the 3 modes you want your aggressors in, whether you're keeping still and double shooting, getting some movement, shooting and charging, and getting large amounts of movement through advancing, and just shooting. From there it's a pretty straightforward thing. You're just going to be advancing into the midfield, bullying enemy units away from it, murdering infantry with excessive amounts of bolter fire, and hopefully following it up with a charge to kill some hard targets or characters. If you're deep striking, then I'd consider trying to start again somewhere in cover, both for overwatch protection or if you fail your charge. And in the shooting phase, try and avoid the temptation to pour too much firepower into the unit that you're just about to charge, just in case you might kill enough of the units that you don't get your 9-inch charge anymore and it becomes far longer or the entire unit goes out of range. I typically fire at something else in the enemy army rather than that unit. Aggressors are one of the most powerful and competitive units in the Space Marine army, but they do have alternatives. Assault Centurions are another very powerful option that fulfill pretty much the same role, and I've made a comparison video on Aggressors to Assault Centurions in another video if you'd just like to search for that. In general, the Assault Centurions are more durable and have better melee damage output, but the aggressors typically will tend to win the shooting war, and greatly so if they're double shooting. Depending on your army or the synergies, or even whether you can take Assault Centurions in some of these armies, they may or may not be the right choice for you. I'd also weigh them up against Terminators, who again have power fists and a large number of bolt shots. The main advantage of Terminators being that they can innately deep strike, so for armies that can't do that, that's a real draw to the Terminators over the Aggressors. In general though, point for point, they're not quite as dangerous in the shooting or fight phase than the Aggressors, but deep striking is a really powerful rule and shouldn't be underestimated. So overall, I think that the Aggressors are a really strong unit for Codex Space Marines, and it's been fun to revisit them. I'm sure they'll remain competitive for a long time to come, unless Games Workshop chooses to nerf them at any point. Their stat line's pretty decent, but I think it's really all these unique buffs that really take them to the next level. As with their unique rules and being powerful in the shooting and fight phase, they're really one of the units that synergize really well with the buffs of the other chapters. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics for more tactics discussions coming every day. And if you'd like to support the channel, I'd just like to mention my Element Games and Amazon affiliate links, which are down in the description below. Basically, if you were thinking about buying some Aggressors or any other 40k in the near future, if you give those a click before you make your purchase from them, a small amount of money goes to help support the channel without costing you yourself any more. Element Games is the UK-based discount retailer that does around 10 to 15% discounts on most 40k products, and the Amazon link works for people in the USA and Canada, and if you give either of them a click, then any buys within the next 24 hours have a small amount go to support the channel. You'll find the links down in the description below if you're interested. In any case, a very big thank you for listening to another video, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.